When I first hung that flag on my porch, I never imagined it would spark a neighborhood war that would end with Karen from the HOA board resigning in disgrace and our story making national headlines. What started as a simple tribute to my late veteran father turned into a battle that exposed the HOA's pattern of silencing patriotic displays, drew the attention of investigative journalists, and ultimately cost the association thousands in legal fees. The morning I replaced that original flag with a rare Civil War regimental banner tied to our state's military history, I knew I was about to make waves, but I had no idea those waves would become a tsunami that would sweep through our entire community. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any more epic Karen stories, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The whole ordeal began on a crisp October morning when I decided to honor my father's memory by hanging his service flag on my front porch. Dad had served 2 tours in Vietnam, and though he rarely spoke about his experiences overseas, I knew the flag represented more than just fabric and colors to him. It represented sacrifice, brotherhood, and the ideals he'd fought to protect. When he passed away 6 months earlier, I'd inherited not just his flag, but also his quiet pride in having served his country. The flag was simple, regulation size, and displayed according to proper flag etiquette, something Dad had taught me as a child. I mounted it on a standard bracket, ensuring it was positioned correctly and would never touch the ground. For 3 peaceful weeks, that flag flew on my porch without incident. Neighbors would nod approvingly when they walked by, and Mrs. Henderson from next door even stopped to tell me how much she appreciated the display. She mentioned that her late husband had also served, and seeing the flag reminded her of him in the best possible way. I felt a sense of connection to my father every time I looked at it fluttering in the breeze, and I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The first notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under my door while I was at work. The letterhead read, Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association in bold, authoritative letters, and the message was brief but pointed. Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that you have installed an unauthorized decoration on your property. According to Section 4.3 of the HOA bylaws, all exterior decorations must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee prior to installation. You are hereby fined $150 for this violation. Please remove the unauthorized item immediately and submit proper paperwork for approval if you wish to reinstall it. The notice was signed by Karen Mitchell, chairwoman of the Architectural Review Committee. I stared at the paper in disbelief. An unauthorized decoration? It was an American flag, displayed with respect and dignity on my own property. I'd lived in Willowbrook Estates for 8 years and had never encountered such rigid interpretation of the HOA rules. Sure, I'd received the occasional notice about lawn maintenance or holiday decorations that stayed up too long, but this felt different. This felt personal, though I couldn't understand why anyone would object to a tastefully displayed American flag. The next morning, I decided to pay Karen Mitchell a visit. I'd seen her around the neighborhood over the years, a woman in her early 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and an air of authority that seemed to precede her wherever she went. She lived in one of the larger homes on Maple Street, a colonial-style house with manicured landscaping that looked like it belonged in a magazine. When I knocked on her door, she answered with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, you must be about the flag situation," she said before I could even introduce myself. "I'm sorry, but rules are rules. The HOA exists to maintain property values and ensure our neighborhood remains attractive to potential buyers. Unauthorized decorations, even patriotic ones, can set a precedent that leads to chaos." I explained that the flag was in honor of my father, a Vietnam veteran who had recently passed away. I showed her the folded flag from his funeral service that I kept in my car, hoping she might understand the personal significance. Karen's expression softened slightly, but her resolve remained firm. "I understand this is personal for you," she said. "But I can't make exceptions. If I allow your flag without proper approval, then everyone will expect the same treatment. We've worked hard to maintain the aesthetic standards of this community. You can certainly apply for approval through the proper channels, but until then, the flag needs to come down." I left her house frustrated but determined to follow the proper procedures. The application process, however, proved to be more complicated than I'd anticipated. The forms required detailed specifications, photographs from multiple angles, and a review period that could take up to 6 weeks. Meanwhile, I was expected to pay the fine and remove the flag immediately. It felt like bureaucratic harassment designed to discourage residents from exercising their rights. 3 days later, another notice appeared under my door. This one was more aggressive in tone. Second violation notice. The unauthorized decoration remains on your property despite previous notification. You are hereby fined an additional $150. Daily fines of $150 will continue until the BINA violation is corrected. The message was clear. Karen wasn't backing down, and neither was the HOA. That weekend, I decided to do some research. I spent hours in the local library and online, diving into HOA law, property rights, and federal regulations regarding flag display. What I discovered was enlightening and infuriating. The Federal Freedom to Display the American Flag Act, passed in 2005, specifically prohibited homeowners associations from restricting the display of the American flag, with only reasonable regulations regarding size, placement, and manner of display allowed. My flag met every reasonable standard, yet Karen continued to send daily fines. Armed with this knowledge, I called the HOA management company and spoke with their legal department. The lawyer I spoke with seemed surprised by my situation and promised to review the case. 2 days later, I received a call back with disappointing news. While the federal law did protect flag display, the HOA's bylaws had been written in such a way that they could argue my flag required pre-approval as part of their reasonable regulations. The legal battle would likely be lengthy and expensive, with no guarantee of success. As the daily fines accumulated, I found myself growing angrier not just at Karen, but at the entire system that seemed designed to silence patriotic expression. The irony wasn't lost on me that in a country my father had fought to protect, I was being penalized for honoring his service. By the end of the second week, I owed over $2,000 in fines, and Karen showed no signs of relenting. Her daily notices had become increasingly formal and threatening, with mentions of liens and legal action if the fines weren't paid. That's when I had my breakthrough moment. If Karen wanted to play hardball with flags, I would give her a flag she couldn't ignore. During my research, I discovered something fascinating about our state's military history. The 15th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry Regiment, which had fought with distinction during the Civil War, had been recruited primarily from our county. Their regimental flag, featuring the state seal and battle orders, was a legitimate piece of military heritage that deserved recognition and respect. I spent the next 3 days tracking down a museum-quality reproduction of the 15th Pennsylvania's colors. The flag was larger than my father's service flag, more colorful, and infinitely more eye-catching. It featured a blue field with the state coat of arms in the center, surrounded by a wreath of roses and flanked by 2 white horses. Battle honors were inscribed in gold lettering around the edges, listing engagements like Antietam, Gettysburg, and Chancellorsville. When I hung it on my porch, it immediately drew attention from neighbors and passers-by. The historical significance of this flag was undeniable. The 15th Pennsylvania had lost nearly 60% of its men during the war, including many from families who had settled in what would eventually become our county. Their sacrifice had helped preserve the Union and had direct connections to our local heritage. If Karen wanted to fine me for displaying this piece of military history, she would have to explain to the community why she was opposing recognition of local Civil War heroes. The new flag had been up for less than 24 hours when I received another visit from Karen. This time, she wasn't alone. She'd brought 2 other HOA board members with her, and all 3 looked agitated. The conversation that followed was tense and revealing. "This is clearly an escalation," Karen began, her voice tight with controlled anger. "You're deliberately trying to circumvent our authority by displaying an even more prominent flag. The size alone violates our signage restrictions." I was ready for this argument. "Actually, Karen, this flag represents the 15th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry Regiment, recruited from this very county during the Civil War. It's a piece of local military history that deserves recognition. The men who served under these colors died fighting for the principles our community was built on. One of the board members, a man I recognized but had never spoken to, seemed intrigued by this information. "I didn't know we had a Civil War regiment from this area," he said, looking at the flag with new interest. "My great-great-grandfather might have served with them." Karen quickly cut him off. "Regardless of its historical significance, it's still an unauthorized decoration. The size and prominence make it even more problematic than the original flag. You're going to receive fines for this as well." "Then I guess you'll be fining me for honoring the memory of local heroes who died defending our freedom," I replied. "I wonder how the community will feel about that." The threat in my words was subtle but unmistakable. Karen's eyes narrowed, and I could see her calculating the potential consequences. She was used to intimidating homeowners into compliance, but this situation was different. This flag had a story, a history, and a connection to our community that would be difficult to dismiss. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I called the local newspaper, the County Herald, and asked to speak with their city reporter. I explained my situation, the mounting fines, and the historical significance of the flag I was now displaying. The reporter, a young woman named Jessica Martinez, seemed immediately interested in the story. "This sounds like it has broader implications," she said during our phone conversation. "HOAs wielding excessive power, suppression of patriotic displays, local history being silenced by bureaucracy. Would you be willing to go on the record with this?" I agreed to an interview, and Jessica arrived at my house the next morning with a photographer. She spent over an hour asking questions about my father's service, the original flag, Karen's response, and the historical significance of the regimental colors. The photographer took dozens of pictures of the flag, my father's service medals, and the stack of violation notices I'd accumulated. "I'd like to speak with other residents about their experiences with the HOA," Jessica said as she prepared to leave. "Do you know of anyone else who's had similar issues?" I gave her the names of 3 neighbors who had mentioned their own struggles with the HOA's arbitrary enforcement. Mrs. Chen had been fined for planting flowers in her front yard without permission. The Johnsons had been cited for having a basketball hoop in their driveway. And old Mr. Kowalski had received violations for displaying a small veteran's license plate frame on his mailbox post. The article appeared in the County Herald 3 days later, complete with a large color photograph of the regimental flag flying on my porch. The headline read, "HOA fines homeowner for honoring war dead." And the story painted a detailed picture of bureaucratic overreach and patriotic suppression. Jessica had done her homework, interviewing 5 other residents who had faced similar harassment from the HOA. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Karen and her committee seemed to target any display of patriotism, military service, or historical pride. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My phone started ringing within hours of the newspaper hitting doorsteps. Neighbors called to express their support, veterans organizations reached out to offer assistance, and local politicians began asking questions about HOA governance. The newspaper's online version of the story was shared thousands of times on social media, with comments pouring in from across the state. Beyond, Karen, meanwhile, had gone silent. No violation notices appeared under my door, no phone calls from the HOA office, no visits from board members. It was as if she had suddenly realized the magnitude of the situation she had created. The community that had once seemed apathetic to HOA overreach was now paying attention. And they didn't like what they saw. The story gained momentum when the local television news picked it up. A crew from Channel 7 arrived at my house to film a segment about the controversy. The reporter interviewed me on my front porch, with the regimental flag prominently displayed in the background. They also sought comment from Karen, but she refused to speak with them. The HOA management company issued a brief statement saying they were reviewing the situation, but offered no substantive response. Social media attention intensified when a video of my television interview was posted online. Veterans groups began sharing the story, and it spread through networks of military families and patriotic organizations. Comments ranged from supportive to outraged, with many people sharing their own experiences with HOA overreach. The hashtag Fly the Flag began trending locally, and several neighbors responded by displaying their own flags in solidarity. The pressure on the HOA board intensified when the American Legion and Veterans of Foreign Wars issued a joint statement condemning the fines and demanding their reversal. These weren't random critics, but respected community organizations with significant political influence. Local politicians began distancing themselves from the HOA's position, and the management company found itself fielding calls from reporters and legal organizations. 1 week after the television story aired, I received an unexpected visitor. A well-dressed man in his 60s knocked on my door and introduced himself as Robert Sterling, a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. He explained that he'd been following my story and was interested in taking my case pro bono. "This isn't just about your flag," he said as we sat in my living room. "This is about the broader issue of HOA overreach and the suppression of constitutional rights. Your case has the potential to set important precedents that could help other homeowners facing similar harassment." Sterling had done his research. He'd obtained copies of the HOA's bylaws, reviewed the Federal Flag Act, and consulted with experts in constitutional law. His preliminary assessment was that the HOA had violated both federal regulations and state laws regarding flag display. More importantly, he believed the pattern of harassment I documented could support claims of discrimination and selective enforcement. "The key to winning this case," he explained, "is demonstrating that the HOA's actions were arbitrary and discriminatory. The fact that they've targeted multiple patriotic displays while ignoring other potential violations shows a pattern of bias. Combined with the federal protections for flag display, we have a strong case for both compensation and injunctive relief." I agreed to let Sterling represent me, and he immediately sent a formal demand letter to the HOA board. The letter outlined the violations of federal law, demanded immediate reversal of all fines, and threatened legal action if the matter wasn't resolved within 30 days. He also sent copies to the local media, ensuring that the HOA's response would be public knowledge. The legal pressure had an immediate effect. Within 48 hours of receiving Sterling's letter, the HOA management company called to schedule a meeting. The tone was conciliatory, with the manager suggesting that perhaps a compromise could be reached. Sterling advised me to attend the meeting but to let him do most of the talking. The meeting was held at the HOA's offices, a small building that seemed designed to intimidate homeowners with its formal atmosphere and intimidating legal notices posted on the walls. Karen was there, along with 2 other board members and the property manager. Everyone looked uncomfortable, and Karen avoided making eye contact with me throughout the proceedings. Sterling presented his case methodically, citing federal law, state regulations, and constitutional precedents. He pointed out that the HOA's own bylaws contained provisions for patriotic displays that seemed to contradict the fines they had issued. Most damaging was his analysis of selective enforcement, showing how the HOA had ignored violations by certain homeowners while aggressively pursuing others. The pattern of targeting patriotic displays while ignoring other violations suggests discriminatory enforcement, Sterling said, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't about maintaining community standards. This is about suppressing expression that certain board members find objectionable." Karen finally spoke, her voice defensive. "We were simply following the established procedures. All exterior decorations require approval, regardless of their nature. We can't make exceptions, even for flags." "Except that federal law specifically protects flag display," Sterling replied. "And your own bylaws contain exceptions for patriotic displays. The problem isn't the rules themselves, but their arbitrary application." The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours, with the HOA's lawyer joining by phone to discuss potential liability. By the end, it was clear that the HOA was in a difficult position. They could fight the case in court, risking significant legal fees and negative publicity, or they could settle and try to limit the damage. 3 days later, I received an official letter from the HOA board. All fines related to flag display were being reversed, and the board was implementing new guidelines that would explicitly protect patriotic displays. The letter was signed by all 5 board members, including Karen, though I suspected she had been pressured into signing. The victory felt good, but it wasn't complete. The real change came when the story reached regional and national media outlets. A conservative news website picked up the story, and it quickly spread through networks of veterans and patriotic organizations. The narrative of HOA overreach suppressing patriotic expression resonated with audiences far beyond our small community. National attention brought new pressures. The HOA found itself fielding calls from journalists, veterans groups, and legal organizations. Their management company was overwhelmed by media requests and began suggesting that significant changes were needed to restore public confidence. The board members, who had signed up to manage landscaping disputes and architectural reviews, found themselves at the center of a national controversy about property rights and patriotic expression. Karen, in particular, seemed to be struggling with the attention. Neighbors reported seeing her looking stressed and avoiding public interactions. The confident authority she had once projected was replaced by obvious discomfort whenever she appeared in public. The role that had once given her power and influence had become a source of embarrassment and scrutiny. The breaking point came when a national veterans organization announced they were considering adding our HOA to their list of organizations that were hostile to patriotic expression. This designation would have been publicized in their newsletter, which reached over 2 million members nationwide. The potential for continued negative attention was more than the board could handle. 2 weeks after the national story broke, I received a phone call from the HOA's property manager. Karen Mitchell was resigning from the board, citing personal reasons and a desire to focus on family matters. The resignation was effective immediately, and the board was announcing a comprehensive review of their policies regarding patriotic displays. The announcement was reported in the local newspaper as a victory for homeowners' rights and patriotic expression. Jessica Martinez, the reporter who had originally covered my story, wrote a follow-up piece that detailed the changes the controversy had brought to our community. Other HOAs in the area had quietly revised their own policies, hoping to avoid similar conflicts. Karen's resignation marked the end of the active conflict, but the effects of the controversy continued to ripple through our community. New board members were elected who were more responsive to homeowner concerns. The HOA's policies were revised to explicitly protect patriotic displays and to provide clearer procedures for addressing violations. Most importantly, the culture of intimidation and arbitrary enforcement that had characterized Karen's tenure was replaced by a more collaborative approach. The regimental flag still flies on my porch, and it has become something of a local landmark. Tour groups studying Civil War history occasionally stop by to see it, and the local historical society has created a display about the 15th Pennsylvania Regiment that includes photographs of the flag. What started as a tribute to my father has become a symbol of community resistance to bureaucratic overreach, and a reminder of the importance of preserving historical memory. Reflecting on the entire experience, I realized that the victory was about more than just hanging a flag. It was about standing up to arbitrary authority, protecting constitutional rights, and preserving the ability of communities to honor their military heritage. Karen's resignation wasn't just the end of a personal conflict, but the beginning of a more democratic and responsive approach to community governance. The legal precedent established by my case has been cited in other HOA disputes across the state. Sterling has received dozens of inquiries from homeowners facing similar harassment, and he's developed a practice area focused on protecting property rights from HOA overreach. The case has become a textbook example of how individual resistance can lead to broader social change. Perhaps most significantly, the controversy has strengthened the bonds within our community. Neighbors who had previously been strangers now know each other's names and stories. The shared experience of opposing arbitrary authority has created connections that extend beyond the original flag dispute. Community meetings that were once sparsely attended are now well-attended forums for discussing local issues. The flag that flies on my porch today represents more than just my father's service or the sacrifice of Civil War soldiers. It represents the principle that communities should be places where patriotic expression is welcomed and protected, where historical memory is preserved and honored, and where arbitrary authority is challenged." End quote. constrained. Every time I see it moving in the breeze, I'm reminded of the importance of standing up for what's right, even when the cost seems high. The story of my flag dispute has become part of our community's oral history, told and retold as an example of how ordinary citizens can challenge institutional power and win. Children in the neighborhood know the story, and several have asked their parents to display flags of their own. The simple act of hanging a flag in honor of my father has become a catalyst for broader conversations about patriotism, community governance, and the importance of preserving military heritage. In the end, Karen's attempt to silence patriotic expression had the opposite effect. Rather than suppressing flag displays, her actions led to more flags flying in our neighborhood than ever before. Rather than strengthening her authority, her overreach led to her resignation and the reform of HOA policies. Rather than maintaining the status quo, her actions catalyzed changes that have made our community more democratic, more responsive, and more respectful of individual rights. The flag still flies on my porch, a daily reminder of my father's service and the community's successful defense of patriotic expression. But more than that, it stands as a symbol of the principle that when ordinary citizens stand up to arbitrary authority, they can create change that extends far beyond their individual situations. The story of my flag dispute has become a story of community empowerment, constitutional rights, and the enduring importance of honoring those who have served our country. As I write this, nearly a year after the controversy began, I can see American flags displayed on porches throughout our neighborhood. Each one represents not just patriotic pride, but also a commitment to the principle that communities should welcome and protect expressions of military heritage. The transformation of our neighborhood from a place where flag displays were discouraged to one where they are celebrated represents the kind of positive change that can emerge from principled resistance to arbitrary authority. The lesson of my flag dispute is simple but powerful. When individuals stand up for their rights and refuse to be intimidated by bureaucratic overreach, they can create changes that benefit entire communities. The flag that flies on my porch today is more than just a piece of cloth. It's a symbol of the enduring importance of patriotic expression, community resistance, and the defense of constitutional rights. And every day that it flies, it reminds me that the principles my father fought to defend are still worth defending today. 6 months after Karen's resignation, I received an unexpected call from the mayor's office. The city council was planning a Memorial Day ceremony at the new Veterans Memorial Park, and they wanted to incorporate the story of my flag dispute into the program. The caller explained that my case had become a symbol of protecting veterans' rights and community values, and they felt it would be appropriate to recognize the broader impact of the controversy. The ceremony was unlike anything I had anticipated. Over 300 people attended, including veterans from multiple wars, active military personnel, and families from throughout the county. The keynote speaker was a retired Army general who had read about my case in a veterans magazine and specifically requested to address the crowd. His speech focused on the civilian duty to protect the freedoms that military service members had fought to preserve. Sometimes the most important battles for freedom are fought not on foreign soil, but in our own neighborhoods, the general said, gesturing toward the regimental flag that had been displayed on a special honor stand. When this homeowner refused to be silenced, he was continuing the fight that these Civil War soldiers began over 150 years ago. The ceremony culminated with the dedication of a new monument featuring the names of all county residents who had died in military service, including the 63 members of the 15th Pennsylvania Band Regiment who had never returned home. The monument was funded entirely through community donations, many of which had been inspired by the publicity surrounding my flag dispute. Local businesses had contributed materials and labor, and the VFW had organized fundraising events that brought the community together in ways that hadn't been seen in decades. But the most meaningful moment came when Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman I had never met, approached me after the ceremony. She explained that her grandson was currently serving in Afghanistan, and she had been afraid to display a service flag because of stories she had heard about HOA harassment. My case had given her the courage to proudly display her grandson's service flag, and she wanted to thank me for standing up to the bullies. "You didn't just fight for your own flag," she said, tears in her eyes. "You fought for all of us who love someone in uniform." The ripple effects of the controversy continued to spread in unexpected ways. Sterling, my lawyer, had been contacted by a documentary filmmaker who was interested in exploring the broader issue of HOA overreach and constitutional rights. The filmmaker had been following several similar cases across the country and believed that my story could serve as a compelling centerpiece for a feature-length documentary. The filming process took several months and involved interviews with dozens of people who had been affected by the controversy. Jessica Martinez, the reporter who had originally covered my story, was interviewed about the role of local journalism in holding institutions accountable. The retired general from the Memorial Day ceremony provided historical context about the importance of patriotic expression in American communities. Even some of the former HOA board members agreed to be interviewed, though Karen declined to participate. The documentary, titled Flying Colors: The Battle for Patriotic Expression, premiered at a regional film festival and was subsequently picked up by a streaming service. The film explored not just my individual case, but the broader pattern of HOA overreach across the country, featuring interviews with constitutional scholars, veterans advocates, and other homeowners who had faced similar challenges. The film's release brought a new wave of attention to the issues raised by my case. Law schools began using it as a teaching tool for courses on property rights and constitutional law. Veterans organizations screened it at meetings and conferences, and it became a rallying point for efforts to reform HOA governance nationwide. One of the most significant developments was the formation of the Homeowners' Rights Coalition, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting property owners from HOA overreach. The coalition was founded by a group of lawyers and activists who had been inspired by my case and others like it. They provided legal resources, educational materials, and advocacy support for homeowners facing similar harassment. The coalition's first major victory came when they successfully lobbied for state legislation that strengthened protections for flag display and other forms of patriotic expression. The law, which became known as the Veterans Honor Act, prohibited HOAs from restricting the display of American flags, military service flags, and historical military banners. The legislation was signed into law by the governor at a ceremony attended by hundreds of veterans and their families. Meanwhile, changes continued to reshape our own community. The new HOA board, elected in the aftermath of Karen's resignation, implemented policies that were far more respectful of homeowner rights. They established a grievance procedure that included mediation and appeals processes, ensuring that future disputes would be handled more fairly. They also created a community advisory committee that included representatives from veterans organizations and historical societies. The transformation was evident in the neighborhood's appearance. Where once there had been a handful of flags scattered throughout the community, now patriotic displays were common and welcomed. The 4th of July celebration that year featured a neighborhood parade where residents proudly displayed flags from different eras of American military history. Children carried small flags, veterans wore their service medals, and families decorated their homes with patriotic themes. The economic impact of the changes was also significant. Property values in our neighborhood had increased as prospective buyers were attracted by the community's reputation for respecting homeowner rights. Real estate agents began marketing the area as a veteran-friendly community where military families could feel comfortable displaying their pride and service. The local historical society capitalized on the interest in military heritage by creating a walking tour that included stops at various flag displays throughout the neighborhood. The tour featured information about the different military units represented and the historical significance of various flag designs. My house became a regular stop on the tour, with guides explaining the story of the 15th Pennsylvania Regiment and the controversy that had brought its flag to prominence. Educational institutions also took notice of the changes in our community. The local high school developed a curriculum unit about civic engagement that used my flag dispute as a case study in citizen activism. Students learned about constitutional rights, local government, and the importance of standing up for principles even when facing powerful opposition. Several students interviewed me for research projects, and their questions often provided fresh perspectives on the events I had lived through. The anniversary of Karen's resignation was marked by a community celebration that few could have imagined during the height of the controversy. The event, organized by the new HOA board, was designed to celebrate the community's commitment to homeowner rights and patriotic expression. Local politicians spoke about the importance of grassroots activism, and veterans organizations presented awards to community members who had supported the fight against arbitrary authority. The celebration also featured the unveiling of a new community flag that incorporated elements from various military banners, including the 15th Pennsylvania Regiment colors that had played such a central role in the controversy. The flag was designed by a local artist in collaboration with veterans groups and historical societies, and it was intended to represent the community's commitment to honoring military service and protecting constitutional rights. As I stood watching the new community flag being raised for the first time, I reflected on how much had changed since that first violation notice had been slipped under my door. What had begun as a simple tribute to my father's service had evolved into a community-wide transformation that had touched hundreds of lives and influenced policy decisions at multiple levels of government. The personal cost of the controversy had been significant. I had spent months dealing with legal issues, media attention, and community conflict. There had been times when I questioned whether the fight was worth the stress and uncertainty it had brought into my life. But seeing the positive changes that had emerged from that conflict, I knew that the struggle had been worthwhile. The flag that still flies on my porch has become more than a memorial to my father or a symbol of resistance to arbitrary authority. It has become a reminder that ordinary citizens have the power to create extraordinary change when they refuse to accept injustice. The story of my flag dispute has become part of our community's identity, a source of pride and inspiration for residents who understand that freedom requires constant vigilance and occasional sacrifice. Years later, when new residents move into our neighborhood, they often ask about the story behind the various flag displays they see throughout the community. Longtime residents are always eager to share the tale of how one homeowner's refusal to be silenced had transformed an entire community. The story has become part of the neighborhood's oral history, passed down from family to family as an example of what can be accomplished when people stand up for what they believe in. The legal precedent established by my case continues to influence HOA disputes across the country. Sterling has represented dozens of homeowners in similar situations, and he often credits my case with providing the foundation for his successful advocacy. The principles established in our fight have been cited in court decisions, legislative hearings, and academic papers about property rights and constitutional law. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the controversy has been the change in community culture. Where once residents had been reluctant to challenge authority or express their beliefs, now there was a spirit of civic engagement that touched many aspects of community life. Neighborhood meetings were better attended, local elections drew more candidates and voters, and residents felt empowered to advocate for their interests and values. The transformation extended beyond our immediate neighborhood to influence HOA policies throughout the region. Other communities, aware of the negative publicity that had surrounded Karen's actions, proactively revised their own policies to avoid similar conflicts. The precedent established by my case had created a climate where HOAs were more cautious about restricting patriotic expression and more responsive to homeowner concerns. The flag that flies on my porch today serves as a daily reminder of the journey from conflict to resolution, from individual resistance to community transformation. It represents not just the memory of my father's service or the sacrifice of Civil War soldiers, but the ongoing responsibility of citizens to protect the freedoms that define our democratic society. Every morning when I see it moving in the breeze, I am reminded that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and that sometimes the most important battles for freedom are fought not on distant battlefields, but in our own neighborhoods, one flag at a time. 2 years after the initial controversy, I received the call that would take the story in yet another unexpected direction. A publisher from New York had read about my case in a magazine article and was interested in turning the experience into a book. The proposed title was "The Flag on My Porch: How One Homeowner's Stand Changed a Community," and the publisher believed it could reach a national audience hungry for stories about grassroots resistance to bureaucratic overreach. Writing the book proved to be both therapeutic and challenging. Revisiting the events forced me to examine not just the external conflicts, but also the internal struggles I had faced during the most difficult moments of the controversy. There had been nights when I lay awake wondering if I was being stubborn rather than principled, mornings when I questioned whether the fight was worth the stress it was causing my family and neighbors. The publisher assigned me a professional ghostwriter who helped shape my memories and reflections into a coherent narrative. Through our conversations, I began to understand that my story was part of a larger pattern of citizen resistance that had shaped American history from the Boston Tea Party to the Civil Rights Movement. The flag dispute wasn't just about HOA policies or patriotic expression. It was about the fundamental question of whether ordinary citizens could successfully challenge institutional power. The book's publication coincided with a surge of national interest in HOA reform. Congressional hearings were examining the practices of homeowners associations, and several states were considering legislation to limit their authority. My case was frequently cited as an example of how HOAs could abuse their power and suppress constitutional rights. The publicity tour for the book took me to cities across the country, where I spoke at bookstores, veterans events, and civic organizations. At each stop, I met people who had faced similar challenges with HOAs, school boards, city councils, and other institutions. Their stories reinforced my belief that the principles at stake in my flag dispute extended far beyond my individual situation. One particularly memorable event was a book signing at a veterans hospital where I met dozens of service members who were dealing with their own battles against bureaucratic indifference. A young Marine who had lost his leg in Iraq told me that reading about my flag dispute had inspired him to challenge his HOA's restrictions on wheelchair accessibility modifications. An elderly Navy veteran mentioned that my story had given him the courage to display his father's World War I service flag despite threats from his retirement community's management. The book's success led to speaking engagements at law schools, where I addressed students about the practical applications of constitutional principles. These talks often focused on the importance of understanding that rights exist not just in theory, but must be actively defended by citizens willing to stand up to authority. Young lawyers frequently approached me after these presentations to discuss their own experiences with institutional resistance and to seek advice about representing clients in similar situations. During one university visit, a political science professor asked me to participate in a panel discussion about civic engagement in the digital age. The conversation explored how social media and online organizing had amplified the impact of my flag dispute in ways that wouldn't have been possible in earlier eras. The professor noted that my case demonstrated how individual acts of resistance could quickly gain national attention and influence policy decisions at multiple levels of government. The digital dimension of the story continued to evolve as online communities formed around the issues raised by my case. A Facebook group called Defenders of the Flag grew to include thousands of members who shared their own experiences with HOA harassment and offered support to others facing similar challenges. The group became a resource for legal advice, emotional support, and strategic planning for people dealing with arbitrary authority. YouTube videos about my case garnered millions of views, with commenters sharing their own stories of standing up to bullies and bureaucrats. The comment sections became virtual town halls where people from across the political spectrum found common ground in their opposition to institutional overreach. Conservative veterans and liberal civil liberties advocates discovered that they shared fundamental beliefs about individual rights and community autonomy. The influence of my case reached international audiences when a British documentary crew visited our neighborhood to film a segment about American homeowners associations for a program about global housing policies. The crew was fascinated by the concept of private organizations wielding government-like authority over residential communities, and they used my story to illustrate both the potential for abuse and the possibility of successful resistance. The international perspective provided new insights into the uniquely American nature of the conflict I had experienced. The British filmmaker noted that while other countries had various forms of community governance, the combination of private authority and constitutional rights that characterized American HOAs created unique opportunities for both oppression and liberation. Academic interest in my case continued to grow as researchers from multiple disciplines found different aspects of the story relevant to their work. Sociologists studied the community dynamics that had enabled both Karen's initial authority and her eventual downfall. Legal scholars examined the constitutional principles involved and their broader implications for property rights. Political scientists analyzed the role of media attention in transforming local conflicts into national issues. One particularly insightful study was conducted by a graduate student in urban planning who examined how the controversy had affected neighborhood cohesion and civic engagement. Her research found that residents who had lived through the flag dispute showed significantly higher levels of participation in local politics and community organizations compared to residents of similar neighborhoods that hadn't experienced such conflicts. The academic attention led to invitations to speak at conferences and symposiums about community governance, constitutional rights, and citizen activism. These events brought me into contact with scholars, activists, and policymakers who were working on related issues across the country. The conversations that emerged from these gatherings often focused on the question of how to maintain the benefits of community organization while preventing the abuses of power that my case had highlighted. 5 years after Karen's resignation, our neighborhood was selected as a case study for a federal research project examining best practices in community governance. The researchers were particularly interested in how our community had transformed its approach to rule enforcement and dispute resolution following the flag controversy. Their report eventually became a model for other communities seeking to reform their own governance structures. The research team found that our neighborhood had developed several innovative approaches to community management that balanced the need for standards with respect for individual rights. The grievance procedures implemented after Karen's departure had successfully resolved dozens of disputes without the acrimony and legal costs that had characterized earlier conflicts. The Community Advisory Committee had become a forum for productive dialogue between residents and the HOA board. Perhaps most significantly, the researchers found that property values in our neighborhood had increased faster than in comparable communities, suggesting that respect for homeowner rights was actually beneficial for bees. Economic development. This finding contradicted one of Karen's primary arguments for strict enforcement, demonstrating that her fears about declining property values had been unfounded. The economic data became particularly important when other communities were considering similar reforms. HOA boards that had been resistant to change began to reconsider their positions when presented with evidence that respecting homeowner rights could actually enhance rather than diminish property values. The practical benefits of reform proved to be as compelling as the constitutional arguments. Media attention continued periodically as anniversaries of key events approached or when new developments occurred. The 5th anniversary of my first violation notice was marked by a feature article in a national magazine that examined the long-term impact of the controversy. The article included interviews with current neighborhood residents, many of whom had moved to the area specifically because of its reputation for respecting homeowner rights. The magazine piece also revealed that Karen had moved to a different state shortly after resigning from the HOA board. According to neighbors who had kept in touch with her, she had never spoken publicly about the flag controversy and had avoided any involvement in community governance in her new location. The article suggested that the experience had been as transformative for her as it had been for the rest of the community, though in very different ways. Local television stations continued to revisit the story during patriotic holidays, often featuring updated segments about the ongoing impact of the controversy. These reports typically showed the various flag displays throughout the neighborhood and interviewed residents about their experiences living in a community that had successfully defended patriotic expression. The coverage invariably attracted new visitors to our neighborhood, including veterans making pilgrimages to see the site where an important battle for their rights had been fought and won. The local VFW post began offering guided tours that included stops at significant locations from the controversy, including my house, the former HOA offices, and the Veterans Memorial Park where the regimental flag was permanently displayed. Tourism related to the flag dispute became significant enough that the city's Economic Development Office began promoting our neighborhood as a destination for patriots and history enthusiasts. A local bed and breakfast reported that a substantial percentage of their guests specifically mentioned the flag story as a reason for their visit to the area. The unintended consequence of becoming a tourist destination was that it further reinforced the community's commitment to the principles that had emerged from the controversy. Residents took pride in their neighborhood's reputation and worked to maintain the welcoming atmosphere that had attracted positive attention from across the country. Local businesses began incorporating patriotic themes into their marketing, and several new establishments opened specifically to serve visitors interested in military history and constitutional rights. A bookstore specializing in military history and political commentary opened near the entrance to our neighborhood, and it quickly became a gathering place for discussions about civic engagement and constitutional basha principles. The 10th anniversary of the original flag dispute was marked by the establishment of an annual Freedom Flag Festival that brought together veterans, constitutional scholars, and community activists from across the region. The festival featured speakers, educational exhibits, and ceremonies honoring military service and constitutional rights. It became one of the largest civic events in our county's history. During the inaugural festival, I was presented with an award from the State Veterans Commission recognizing my contributions to protecting veterans' rights. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, including many who had followed the story from its beginning and others who had learned about it through books, documentaries, or academic studies. The festival also featured the premiere of a short film created by high school students who had researched the flag controversy as part of a civics education project. Their film provided a fresh perspective on the events, focusing particularly on how the experience had influenced young people's understanding of citizenship and civic responsibility. The student film sparked discussions about the educational value of the flag dispute and led to the development of curriculum materials that teachers could use to help students understand the practical applications of constitutional principles. School districts in several states began incorporating the story into their civics education programs, using it as an example of how individual citizens could effect meaningful change through principled resistance. As I reflected on the decade that had passed since that first violation notice appeared under my door, I was struck by the realization that the story had taken on a life of its own that extended far beyond my original intentions. What had begun as a simple tribute to my father's service had become a symbol of citizen empowerment and constitutional rights that continued to inspire people across the country. The flag still flies on my porch, weathered by years of wind and rain but undiminished in its significance. It has become more than a piece of fabric. It has become a beacon for anyone who believes that individual citizens have both the right and the responsibility to stand up to arbitrary authority. Every day that it flies, it serves as a reminder that the freedoms we cherish must be actively defended by ordinary people willing to take extraordinary stands for what they believe in. 15 years after the controversy began, I received an invitation that brought the story full circle in ways I never could have anticipated. The Smithsonian Institution was developing an exhibit about American civic engagement and wanted to include artifacts from my flag dispute as part of their collection. They were particularly interested in acquiring the original violation notices, photographs from the controversy, and if possible, a piece of the actual regimental flag that had sparked the national attention. The museum curator who contacted me explained that my case had become recognized as a significant example of grassroots constitutional advocacy in the early 21st century. She noted that historians were already studying the flag dispute as part of a broader pattern of citizen resistance to institutional overreach that characterized the era. The inclusion in the Smithsonian collection would ensure that future generations could learn about the principles and courage that had driven the controversy. Preparing the artifacts for donation required me to revisit documents and photographs I hadn't examined in years. Among the papers, I discovered letters from supporters that I had forgotten about, including notes from veterans in nursing homes who had been inspired by news coverage of the dispute. One particularly moving letter came from a World War II veteran who wrote that seeing someone fight for the right to display a flag had reminded him why he had been willing to fight for his country in the first place. The Smithsonian donation ceremony was attended by representatives from veterans organizations, constitutional scholars, and community leaders from across the country. The event was held in the museum's main hall, with the regimental flag displayed prominently alongside other artifacts representing American civic engagement throughout history. Standing in that hallowed space, surrounded by objects that had shaped our nation's development, I felt the weight of how far the story had traveled from that first violation notice. During the ceremony, a historian from Georgetown University delivered remarks about the broader significance of my case within the context of American democratic traditions. She drew connections between my flag dispute and earlier examples of citizen resistance, from the colonial opposition to British taxation, to the civil rights movement's challenge to segregation. Her analysis suggested that my experience represented a continuation of democratic processes that had been essential to American freedom since the nation's founding. The academic recognition led to an unexpected opportunity when Harvard Law School invited me to serve as a visiting lecturer for a semester-long course on constitutional advocacy. The position involved teaching law students about the practical challenges of defending constitutional rights at the community level, using my experience as a case study in effective grassroots legal strategy. Working with law students provided fresh perspectives on the events I had lived through. These young lawyers asked probing questions about strategic decisions, legal precedents, and the psychological pressures of standing up to institutional authority. Their analysis helped me understand aspects of my own experience that I had never fully examined, particularly the role that media attention had played in shifting the balance of power between individual homeowners, HOA authorities. One student's research project examined how social media had amplified the impact of my case in ways that earlier generations of activists couldn't have imagined. Her analysis showed that the viral spread of my story had created a national conversation about HOA overreach that influenced policy decisions in dozens of states. The speed and reach of digital communication had transformed what might have been a purely local dispute into a catalyst for nationwide reform. The Harvard experience also connected me with legal scholars who were working on related issues in other contexts. I met professors studying corporate governance, municipal authority, and international human rights who found parallels between my flag dispute and their own areas of expertise. These conversations broadened my understanding of how the principles involved in my case applied to challenges far beyond HOA governance. After completing the Harvard residency, I was approached by a foundation that funded civic education initiatives. They wanted to support the development of a comprehensive educational program based on my experience that could be used in high schools and colleges across the country. The proposed curriculum would teach students about constitutional rights, civic engagement, and effective advocacy through interactive simulations based on real-world cases like mine. The curriculum development process took 2 years and involved collaboration with educators, constitutional scholars, and civic engagement experts. The resulting program, called Standing Up: Constitutional Rights in Practice, included role-playing exercises where students could experience the challenges and opportunities of defending constitutional principles in their own communities. The program was piloted in 20 schools across 5 states, with remarkable results. Teachers reported that students who participated in the simulations showed increased understanding of constitutional principles and greater willingness to engage in civic activities. Many students used lessons from the curriculum to address issues in their own schools and communities, from student speech rights to local environmental concerns. One particularly striking example came from a high school in Oregon, where students used techniques learned from my case to challenge their school district's restrictions on patriotic clothing. The students organized effectively, researched their legal rights, and engaged with media to build public support for their position. Their successful campaign resulted in policy changes that protected student expression while maintaining appropriate educational standards. The success of the educational program led to invitations to speak at international conferences about civic education and democratic participation. These events brought me into contact with educators and activists from countries around the world who were working to strengthen democratic institutions in their own societies. At a conference in Berlin, I met teachers from emerging democracies who were particularly interested in how ordinary citizens could effectively challenge authority while working within legal and democratic frameworks. My story resonated with educators from countries where democratic institutions were still developing and where citizens were learning to exercise rights that had been suppressed under previous authoritarian regimes. The international perspective highlighted aspects of my experience that I had taken for granted as uniquely American. Conference participants noted that the legal protections I had been able to invoke, the media freedom that had amplified my story, and the democratic processes that had enabled community transformation, or privileges that many people around the world were still fighting to achieve. These conversations reinforced my appreciation for the democratic institutions that had made my successful resistance possible, while also highlighting the responsibility that comes with such freedoms. Citizens in democratic societies have not just the right, but the obligation to actively defend the principles that enable their freedoms to exist. The 20th anniversary of the original flag dispute was marked by a White House ceremony where I was honored along with other citizen activists who had made significant contributions to protecting constitutional rights. The event was attended by members of Congress, Supreme Court justices, and representatives from civil liberties organizations who had been influenced by various cases of grassroots constitutional advocacy. During the ceremony, the president spoke about the importance of citizen engagement in maintaining democratic institutions. He specifically mentioned my flag dispute as an example of how individual courage could inspire broader social change and strengthen constitutional protections for all Americans. The recognition felt surreal, considering that the journey had begun with a simple desire to honor my father's military service. The White House event also provided opportunities to meet other activists whose stories had inspired me over the years. I spoke with civil rights veterans who had fought much larger battles under far more dangerous circumstances, and their perspectives helped me understand my own experience within the broader context of American militia. Democratic development. One conversation that particularly moved me was with an elderly woman who had participated in voter registration drives in the Deep South during the 1960s. She told me that reading about my flag dispute had reminded her that the fight for constitutional rights never really ends, and that each generation must be willing to stand up for the principles that previous generations had defended. Following the White House ceremony, I was invited to serve on the board of directors for the Constitutional Rights Foundation, a nonprofit organization that supported civic education and constitutional advocacy. The position involved working with legal scholars, educators, and activists to develop programs that would prepare future generations to defend democratic principles. The foundation work brought me into contact with young activists who were addressing contemporary challenges to constitutional rights. I worked with college students organizing free speech demonstrations, high school activists challenging censorship in their schools, and community organizers fighting for transparency in local government. Their energy and commitment reminded me that the principles I had defended were alive and evolving in new generations. One project that particularly excited me was a partnership with technology companies to develop digital tools that could help citizens navigate legal challenges to their constitutional rights. The AP-based system provided information about relevant laws, connected users with appropriate legal resources, and facilitated community organizing around shared constitutional concerns. The digital platform proved especially valuable for people facing HOA disputes similar to mine. Users could access template legal documents, connect with experienced advocates, and find communities of support for their battles against arbitrary authority. The platform's success demonstrated how technology could amplify the same principles of mutual support and shared resistance that had been crucial to my own victory. As I approached my 70th birthday, I began to reflect more deeply on the legacy of the flag dispute and what it had taught me about American democracy. The experience had shown me that ordinary citizens possess far more power than they typically realize, but also that exercising that power requires courage, persistence, and strategic thinking. The flag that still flies on my porch has become a symbol not just of my father's service or the community's successful resistance to arbitrary authority, but of the ongoing responsibility that each generation bears to protect democratic institutions. Every day that it waves in the breeze, it reminds me that freedom is not a possession but a practice, requiring constant vigilance and occasional sacrifice from those who value it. Looking back over more than 2 decades since that first violation notice appeared under my door, I am amazed by the journey that simple act of defiance has taken me on. What began as a personal tribute to my father's military service became a national symbol of constitutional resistance, an educational tool for future generations, and ultimately a reminder that democratic freedoms survive only when ordinary citizens are willing to defend them. The lessons learned from the flag dispute continue to influence my daily life and my interactions with the community around me. I have become more attentive to signs of arbitrary authority, more willing to speak up when I see injustice, and more committed to supporting others who are fighting their own battles for constitutional rights. Recent years have brought new challenges that have tested the principles established during the flag controversy. Changes in federal immigration policy, debates over surveillance and privacy rights, and conflicts over religious expression have all created situations where citizens needed to decide whether to accept government authority or to resist in defense of constitutional principles. In each case, I have tried to apply the lessons learned from my own experience. The importance of understanding legal rights, the value of building community support, the power of media attention in shifting public opinion, and the necessity of persistence in the face of institutional resistance. These principles have proven applicable to a wide range of constitutional challenges, from local disputes to national policy debates. The flag dispute has also influenced my approach to mentoring young people who are facing their own battles with authority. Whether they are students challenging school policies, workers confronting workplace discrimination, or citizens fighting municipal corruption, I try to share the strategic insights and emotional support proved crucial during my own struggle. One of the most important lessons I try to convey is that successful resistance to arbitrary authority requires both moral courage and practical wisdom. It is not enough to be right about the principles at stake. Effective advocacy also requires understanding legal procedures, building strategic alliances, and communicating effectively with different audiences. The story of my flag dispute continues to evolve as new generations encounter it and find their own meanings in the events that transpired. Young people reading about the controversy often focus on different aspects than older readers, seeing lessons about social media activism, grassroots organizing, and the intersection of local and national politics that I hadn't fully appreciated at the time. These evolving interpretations remind me that the significance of any act of resistance extends beyond the original intentions of those involved. My decision to hang a flag in honor of my father created ripple effects that are still spreading decades later, influencing people and institutions in ways I never could have predicted. The flag on my porch remains a daily reminder of these ongoing impacts and responsibilities. Each morning when I see it flying, I am reminded not just of my father's service and the community's successful defense of constitutional rights, but of the continuing obligation to remain vigilant in protecting the democratic institutions that make such victories possible.